Imagine you go out today, right?
Yeah.
And you drop like $600 or $700 on this top-tier piece of wearable technology.
Oh, yeah. A huge investment.
Right. You're buying this thing to optimize your physical performance, track your recovery, really understand your body better.
Exactly.
So you strap it on your wrist, it powers up, and it just starts collecting millions of data points.
Yeah.
But imagine discovering that the core brain of this device, like the algorithm deciding if you could go run a marathon today or just stay in bed well, it fundamentally thinks you are a 25-year-old man.
Which is a huge problem.
Right. If you're listening to this and you're part of the nearly 50% of the population that is female, that is not some hypothetical scenario. It is the actual mathematical reality of what happens every single morning when you check your readiness score.
Yeah, it really is a massive structural gap in how we measure human performance. I mean, the wearable technology industry has essentially built its algorithms, its reference ranges, all its training recommendations, entirely around male physiology.
Just completely built around it.
Right. So the devices are actually gathering incredibly accurate raw data, like your heart rate, your temperature, your sleep stages. But the interpretation layer that gets applied to that data, well, it treats female physiology as if it were simply a male body producing, like, anomalous or weird data.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission for this deep dive into the source material is built entirely around some incredibly detailed reporting from the 5krunner.com.
And their coverage is just fantastic on this.
It really is. We're going to look exclusively at their coverage on the intersection of female athlete physiology, hormonal changes, and wearable tech. And the central theme we are pulling from all these sources is basically this: female bodies change in highly predictable, highly measurable ways across the menstrual cycle, during pregnancy, and into menopause.
Measurable being the key word there.
Exactly. But the wearable tech industry overwhelmingly treats these cyclical changes as just noise.
Yeah. And the coverage from the 5K runner argues forcefully that this is not just an annoying little glitch that we can, note in a manual and move on from.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Much bigger. Treating female physiology as noise produces actively misleading data. I mean, it completely undermines an athlete's daily training decisions.
Wow.
And in some severe cases, which we'll get into, it can actually mask serious clinical conditions behind what looks like a perfectly normal recovery or fitness number.
So it's actively dangerous in some contexts.
Exactly. We really need to dissect not just what the watch is outputting, but the underlying biological and, algorithmic mechanics of exactly why it fails.
I love that. So I want to start right at the core of the conflict, which is essentially how we structure time.
Mm-hmm.
If you download a standard marathon training plan off the internet, or you look at the way a Garmin or a WEEP structures your training load, it almost universally operates on a 7-day calendar week.
Right. The classic Monday to Sunday block.
Yeah. You have a rest day on Monday, maybe interval training on Tuesday, a long run on Sunday. The entire architecture of the training software assumes that the biological foundation of the athlete just magically resets every 7 days.
And that right there is the foundational biological mismatch. I mean, female physiology just does not operate on a 7-day week.
Right.
It operates on a hormonal cycle that averages roughly 28 days. The internal environment, like the core temperature, the metabolic rate, even ligament laxity, is fundamentally shifting from week to week.
It's a constantly moving target.
Exactly.
Yep.
And to put a really fine point on how disruptive this mismatch is, the 5K runner coverage highlights a 2018 study. This was published in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance.
Okay.
They found that 77.4% of elite female athletes, specifically those who are not using hormonal contraceptives, reported negative side effects during their menstrual cycle that actively impacted their training.
Wait, nearly 80%.
Yep, nearly 80%.
That is insane. These are people whose entire professional existence is dedicated to optimizing their physical output, and the vast majority are out there fighting their own standard training plans.
Fighting the plans, fighting the data.
Yeah. So to understand why those standard metrics fail, we really have to look at the mechanisms, right? We need to look at what the hormones are actually doing under the hood.
We do.
Let's break down this 28-day cycle, starting with the first half, the follicular phase. So this is day 1 of the cycle through roughly day 13. What is actually happening hormonally here?
So the follicular phase begins on the first day of menstruation and runs right up until ovulation. The defining characteristic of this phase is that estrogen levels are steadily rising, while progesterone remains very low.
Okay, so high estrogen, low progesterone.
Right. And in the context of exercise physiology, estrogen acts in a lot of ways as a performance and recovery enhancer.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Biologically, rising estrogen actually improves the body's ability to recover from muscular damage. It actively supports protein synthesis.
Wait, so it means the muscle fibers you tear during a heavy lift repair more efficiently.
Exactly. You bounce back faster.
That's amazing. But the sources also mention it reduces perceived exertion. Walk me through the mechanism of that, because perceived exertion sounds entirely subjective, like it's just in your head.
It does sound subjective, but it is deeply neurological.
Okay.
Estrogen actually interacts with the central nervous system to blunt the fatigue signals that are traveling from your working muscles to your brain.
No way.
Yeah. So say you're running an 8-minute mile pace. The actual mechanical work your muscles are doing is exactly the same, but the brain interprets the effort as less strenuous because the estrogen is literally turning down the volume on the fatigue signals.
That is wild.
It is. And furthermore, estrogen actively reduces systemic inflammation.
So during these first roughly 13 days, your body is biologically primed to absorb stress, build muscle, and just bounce back quickly.
Perfectly primed.
Okay, so what does this physiological state look like when it's fed into a wearable algorithm? Does the watch get this right?
Oh, the wearable data during the follicular phase looks exceptional. It loves this phase. Let's look at heart rate variability, or HRV, which is, the key metric most of these algorithms use to determine recovery.
Right.
HRV measures the millisecond fluctuations between your heartbeats. It is the direct result of a tug-of-war between your sympathetic nervous system, which is the fight-or-flight stress response, and your parasympathetic nervous system, which governs rest and digest.
Right, and just to clarify for anyone who gets tripped up on HRV, a higher variability is a good thing.
Yeah,
right?
yes, exactly.
It means your body is relaxed enough that your heart can react dynamically to different demands, rather than just beating rigidly like a metronome.
That is the absolute perfect way to understand it. When estrogen is high and inflammation is low, the parasympathetic nervous system is highly active.
The rest and digest side.
Right. Therefore, your HRV remains very stable or even climbs to its highest points of the month. Concurrently, your resting heart rate sits at its lowest baseline.
Okay, that makes sense.
So if you look at your Garmin, you will likely see your body battery metric regenerating to a full 100% almost every single night.
Because the inputs are also good.
Exactly. Your training readiness scores will be consistently in the green. The algorithm looks at this data, accurately interprets a recovered system, and gives you the green light to go out and push your training volume.
So the algorithm and the biology are totally aligned here. Everything is working.
Yeah.
But then we hit the threshold. We reach ovulation, and the body transitions into the luteal phase, which is the second half of the cycle.
Yeah.
And the entire hormonal landscape just flips.
The shift is dramatic.
Yeah.
And it's rapid. Post-ovulation, progesterone surges and becomes the dominant hormone.
All right.
And progesterone completely rewrites the physiological equation, primarily because it is thermogenic.
Thermogenic meaning it creates heat.
Exactly. It acts directly on the hypothalamus in the brain, which is essentially the body's internal thermostat, and it resets the baseline temperature higher.
How much higher are we talking?
It increases resting core body temperature by about 0.3 to 0.5 degrees Celsius.
Okay, half a degree Celsius might not sound like a massive spike to someone just sitting at a desk typing emails. But if you consider endurance sports, running a 10K is fundamentally a heat management problem, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Your body is basically a biological engine, and a massive amount of its energy goes toward cooling itself down so you don't overheat and pass out.
Think about the physics of it. If your baseline internal temperature is already elevated by half a degree before you even start your warm-up, your cardiovascular system has to work significantly harder just to manage routine heat dissipation.
Because it's already starting from behind.
Exactly. The blood vessels near the skin have to dilate more. The 5K runner coverage provides a really stark example of this cardiovascular tax.
Oh, yeah.
So, a runner holding a 5-minute and 30-second per kilometer pace might sit at a comfortable 148 beats per minute during her follicular phase. But in her mid-luteal phase, running that exact same speed on the exact same route, her heart rate will jump to 154 or even 157 beats per minute.
Wow.
The external mechanical work is identical. The internal cardiovascular stress has absolutely spiked.
And the wearable on her wrist is tracking every single one of those extra heartbeats.
Every single one.
So what happens to the dashboard metrics during this luteal phase? Do they just tank?
They completely crater. Because the cardiovascular system is working harder simply to exist at rest, the resting heart rate elevates by an average of 2 to 5 beats per minute overnight.
Even while she's sleeping?
Yes. Because the body is in a state of systemic physiological stress just managing the progesterone load, the sympathetic nervous system takes over.
The fight or flight side.
Exactly. And that means HRV drops significantly. The variability between beats becomes really rigid.
And the Garmin algorithms, which synthesize all this into a single score, they just see the rigidity and the high heart rate.
They see the rigidity, they see the elevated resting heart rate, and they see the sleep disturbances caused by the elevated core temperature.
So it looks like a disaster on the screen.
Right. So you wake up, you check your Garmin, and your body battery has just stagnated. It might be stuck in the high 20s or low 30s despite getting a full 8 hours of sleep. Your training readiness score flashes bright red.
Here is where the absolute misinterpretation happens. If a runner looks at that dashboard and doesn't explicitly understand the thermogenic mechanics of her luteal phase, what conclusion is she going to draw?
She will draw the exact conclusion the software is designed to prompt. She will think she is overtraining.
Right.
She will assume she is failing to recover from her last workout, or perhaps she is coming down with a virus. The algorithm was built on models validated against male physiology, where the baseline hormonal and thermal environment remains relatively flat across a whole month.
So it has no frame of reference for this.
None at all. So when a male athlete's HRV drops suddenly and his resting heart rate spikes by 5 beats per minute, it almost always means system overload.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The software treats the female athlete's predictable, natural hormonal shift as physiological noise, or worse, as a direct consequence of training way too hard.
It's like relying on a car's computer system that is perfectly calibrated to measure fuel efficiency, but it has no sensors to detect the external terrain.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Like you start driving up a steep mountain pass, your speed drops, the RPM spike, and the engine starts burning fuel twice as fast. And the computer throws a warning light saying, engine failure, you are losing power.
Yeah.
But the engine isn't failing. You are just driving up a 15-degree incline. The engine is doing exactly what it's supposed to do given the terrain. But the computer only understands flat roads.
I love that analogy. And taking it a step further, if the driver believes the computer over their own eyes, they might pull over and stop driving entirely thinking the car is broken. And that is exactly what the sources warn against. Athletes need to understand the structural mechanics of why their data looks the way it does. If you blindly follow a readiness score that lacks a topological map of the menstrual cycle, you will spend 2 weeks out of every single month needlessly second-guessing your fitness.
And potentially sabotaging your own training blocks in the process.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that covers the daily recovery metrics.
Oh.
But if our day-to-day data is being skewed by an algorithm that thinks a hormonal shift is a sickness, how does this algorithmic blind spot affect the long-term measurements?
It gets worse.
Right, because Garmin doesn't just tell you how you slept, it projects your overall athletic potential. It gives you a VO2 Max estimate. And in the endurance community, VO2 Max is treated like a sacred text. It's the ultimate objective badge of cardiovascular fitness.
It is treated as objective, but unfortunately, the VO2 Max estimate produced by these wearables is subject to the exact same algorithmic biases.
I figured.
However, the mechanics of how the error occurs in this specific calculation are much more complex and, frankly, more deeply entrenched in the history of sports science.
Okay, let's define the terms first before we completely tear down the math. What is VO2 Max actually measuring on a cellular level? Because I know there isn't a tiny chemistry lab inside the watch measuring the gas I'm exhaling.
Right, definitely no chemistry lab in there.
Yeah.
True VO2 max, which stands for volume of oxygen maximum, is a measurement of the maximum rate at which your heart, lungs, and muscles can effectively take in oxygen from the air, transport it through your bloodstream, and use it at the cellular level in the mitochondria to produce energy.
Okay.
To measure this objectively, you have to be in a clinical laboratory on a treadmill, wearing a respiratory gas analysis mask that measures the precise volume of oxygen you breathe in versus the carbon dioxide you breathe out.
Pushing yourself to absolute physical failure.
Exactly. Until you literally cannot take another step.
Okay, so since my Garmin cannot measure the gas I am breathing, and I'm not running to absolute failure on my Tuesday morning jog, how is it generating a specific numerical value for my VO2 max?
It is entirely an algorithmic estimation. Garmin primarily relies on an algorithm originally developed by a sports science company called Firstbeat.
Okay.
This algorithm relies on something called submaximal extrapolation.
Submaximal extrapolation. What does that mean?
It basically analyzes the relationship between your running pace and your heart rate during your standard everyday runs. It specifically looks for 20 to 30-second windows where your heart rate is elevated, usually above 70% of its theoretical maximum, and your pace is steady.
Okay, so it finds a stable effort.
Right. I mean, it takes that data point, plots it on a graph, and then uses linear regression to draw a line upward, essentially guessing what your pace would be if your heart rate were pushed to its absolute maximum limit.
Hold on. So it's looking at me running a comfortable 9-minute mile at 145 beats per minute and using that single data point to mathematically guess the absolute ceiling of my cardiovascular output.
That is the fundamental mechanism, yes.
That feels like a huge leap.
It is a leap, but to build an algorithm capable of guessing maximum capacity from a comfortable jog, you cannot just use a blank mathematical slate. You have to train that algorithm on massive amounts of pre-existing exercise physiology research.
You have to feed it data.
Exactly. You have to feed it thousands of laboratory-verified VO2 Max tests so the software actually learns what a normal pace-to-heart rate ratio looks like at various fitness levels.
And let me guess, the baseline data they fed into the machine was not exactly representative of the general population.
Not even close. According to the coverage from the 5K runner, we can look at a 2023 validation study published by Wecha and colleagues.
Okay, what did they find?
This study analyzed 5,260 endurance athletes to evaluate these exact types of algorithms. Out of those 5,260 athletes, 84.76% were male.
Almost 85% of the underlying data set is male bodies.
Yes.
I mean, from a purely data science perspective, if you train a predictive model on a data set that is heavily skewed, the mathematical outputs are going to map exclusively to the physiology of the majority group. It's just a massive sampling error.
It is a sampling error that dictates the algorithm's entire worldview.
Wow.
Female physiology differs from male physiology in ways that directly alter the pace-to-heart rate relationship. Women generally have different hemoglobin concentrations in their blood, different body composition ratios, and different left ventricular stroke volumes in the heart.
So structurally, the plumbing is just a bit different.
Exactly. But even beyond those structural differences, the actual curve, the way a female athlete's heart rate responds to an increase in pace, is highly variable, particularly when you factor in the thermogenic load of the luteal phase we just discussed.
Right. Because if I'm in my luteal phase and progesterone has pushed my core temperature up, my heart rate might be 5 beats per minute higher at my standard 9-minute mile pace.
Exactly.
The algorithm sees that higher heart rate, assumes I'm struggling to maintain a pace I usually find easy, and quietly downgrades my VO2 Max score in the background. It literally interprets a hormonal load as a loss of cardiovascular fitness.
It absolutely does. But what is truly fascinating about the research covered by the sources is that the algorithms don't just produce random scattered errors. They produce what is called a directional error.
A directional error, what does that mean?
It means the bias skews in very specific directions depending on which brand's algorithm you are wearing.
Explain that. How does it skew?
The sources cite research showing that Garmin devices generally have a systemic tendency to underestimate VO2 max for women while simultaneously overestimating it for men.
Oh, wow.
But conversely, older Polar devices, specifically the V800 model running a different algorithm, showed the exact opposite systemic pattern. It was overestimating fitness for women and underestimating it for men.
That is wild. The bias is literally hard-coded into the mathematical assumptions of the software.
Yep.
But wait, I was reading the notes on the 2025 study by Engel and colleagues regarding the Garmin Forerunner 245. It seems like this algorithmic penalty gets significantly worse if you are actually a highly competitive female athlete. Walk me through that math, because that sounds completely counterintuitive.
The 2025 Engel study is a perfect illustration of how algorithms break when they encounter edge cases they just weren't trained on. They evaluated the Garmin Forerunner 245 against laboratory VO2 Max testing. For recreational and moderately trained athletes, the algorithm held up reasonably well. I mean, the mean absolute percentage error was only around 2.8 to 4.1%.
That's not terrible.
No, it's fine. However, when the researchers tested highly trained female athletes, the algorithm just fell apart.
What happened?
It underestimated the true fitness of these elite women by a massive margin of 6.3 milliliters per minute per kilogram.
A 6.3-point drop in VO2 max is astronomical. That is literally the difference between an elite runner and a mid-pack amateur. Why is the watch actively punishing the most fit women?
It punishes them because it cannot comprehend their efficiency?
Their efficiency.
Yes. Highly trained endurance athletes develop incredibly strong, efficient hearts. Because their stroke volume is so large, they can pump massive amounts of blood with very few beats.
Okay.
Therefore, at submaximal paces, say, an 8-minute mile, an elite female runner will have an unusually low heart rate.
Right, because her heart doesn't have to work hard at all.
Exactly. But because the Garmin algorithm was trained primarily on recreational and moderately trained male populations, it has no reference data for a highly trained female heart rate curve.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. It looks at the exceptionally low heart rate data and essentially concludes, well, this data does not fit any of my models for high fitness, therefore it must be an anomaly, or this person just belongs in a lower fitness category.
It literally misreads absolute biological efficiency as an error. It lacks the mathematical imagination to understand how fit she actually is.
That's exactly it.
And all of this algorithmic bias assumes that the raw data going into the watch is perfectly accurate to begin with. But the VO2 max calculation requires heart rate data. And if you are relying on the optical sensor on the back of the watch, the data going into the flawed equation is probably flawed itself, right?
This is the compounding secondary problem. The algorithm assumes a flawless input. But wrist-based optical heart rate sensors have massive error margins compared to electrical chest strap.
Well, how massive?
The sources point to an American College of Cardiology press release detailing research presented at ACC.17. Under certain exercise conditions, wrist device error margins can fluctuate anywhere from plus or minus 15 to a staggering 34 beats per minute.
34 beats per minute. If I'm running hard and my true heart rate is 150, but my watch is recording 184, any VO2 max calculation derived from that data point is just pure, unadulterated fiction.
It is entirely fictional. Firstbeat's own internal documentation acknowledges this, actually. Their validation data indicates that when an athlete uses a chest strap, the error rate of the VO2 max estimate sits around a relatively acceptable 5%.
Okay, that's workable.
But if you rely solely on the optical wrist sensor, the error margin expands substantially, often introducing an additional error of 5 to 8 points on the VO2 max scale.
So, pragmatically speaking, what is a female runner supposed to do with this number staring back at her from the Garmin app? Should she just, turn the feature off entirely?
The sources from the 5K runner provide very clear, actionable directives here. First, if you place any value on the VO2 max estimate at all, you absolutely must use a chest strap like the Garmin HRM600 for any run that you want the algorithm to evaluate.
You have to force the clean data.
Exactly. You must forcefully remove the optical sensor error from the equation. Second, and this is critical, you must manually determine and input your true maximum heart rate into the device settings.
Let's expand on that maximum heart rate point, because by default, these watches use that famous 220 minus your age formula, right?
Yeah.
Why is that formula so destructive to the data?
The 220 minus your age formula is a population-level statistical average from the 1970s. It was never intended to be applied to individual endurance athletes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. For many trained athletes, that formula can be off by 10 to 20 beats per minute. Firstbeat's data shows that if your maximum heart rate setting in the app is wrong by just 15 beats, it will induce a 7 to 9% error in the final VO2 max calculation.
Just from that one setting being off.
Right. Because the algorithm's entire extrapolation curve relies on knowing exactly where the ceiling is. If the ceiling is wrong, the entire line is wrong.
So what do you do instead?
You have to go to a track, perform a grueling ramp test to find your actual maximum heart rate, and plug that specific number into the app.
And if an athlete does all of that, say she wears the chest strap, she inputs her true max heart rate, and she purposefully ignores the data during her luteal phase.
Even if she controls for every single variable, the overarching advice is to treat the resulting number purely as a long-term directional trend. never as an objective diagnostic fact.
Right.
If you need to make a major consequential decision, such as establishing your marathon race pace for a qualifying event, or determining if a 6-month polarized training block actually yielded physiological adaptations, you must ignore the wearable entirely and go pay for a respiratory gas analysis test in a clinical lab.
Okay, so the algorithms are stubbornly male-biased, and it is highly unlikely the manufacturers are going to completely rewrite their core software architecture anytime soon.
Hmm.
So how does a female athlete actually exist in this technological ecosystem today? How does she take these flawed metrics and build the context herself?
This brings us to the practical application of cycle-synced training.
Okay.
Currently, Garmin software does not natively integrate the menstrual phase into its primary training readiness scores. It allows you to log your period, but it treats menstrual tracking more like a standalone wellness diary rather than a core physiological variable.
So it's not talking to the other parts of the app.
Exactly. Therefore, the athlete has to become her own data analyst. She has to manually cross-reference the data sets.
I want to walk through exactly how to do this. Let's look at the Garmin Training Readiness Score, which aggregates sleep, HRV, and load into a single number from 0 to 100. How should a user interpret this number differently based on her cycle?
Let's start with the follicular phase, days 1 through 13. If you are in this phase, and your Garmin dashboard shows a training readiness score above 70, accompanied by a stable HRV and steady sleep data, that is your biological window to push the intensity.
That's the green light.
Yes. That is when you schedule your severe VO2 max intervals, your aggressive threshold workouts, and your heavy, high-intensity interval training. As we discussed earlier, your body is primed to absorb that specific type of central nervous system stress and repair the tissue damage efficiently.
That makes total sense. Capitalize on the estrogen. But what happens 2 weeks later? Say I'm in my mid-luteal phase, a week before my period. My training readiness score is sitting in the mediocre middle, maybe a 55 or 60. The app isn't telling me to stop, but it isn't giving me a green light either.
A score of 60 in the luteal phase requires a totally different tactical approach than a score of 60 in the follicular phase.
How so?
The sources advise that when you see this moderate readiness score during the high progesterone phase, you should actively scale down your overall volume and shift your training focus to aerobic zone 2 endurance work.
Oh wait, earlier you said that the progesterone elevates the heart rate. So if I try to go out and run my standard zone 2 pace, my heart rate isn't going to stay in zone 2, is it?
Precisely the problem. Because your cardiovascular system is already under immense thermogenic strain from the progesterone, attempting to maintain your standard zone 2 pace will likely force your heart rate to drift upward into zone 3.
Oh, I see.
Physiologically, you are no longer doing an easy aerobic base run. You are doing a moderate threshold run, compounding the stress on a body that is already working hard to cool itself.
So what's the solution?
You have to swallow your pride, drop your actual running pace, and let your heart rate settle back down into the true zone 2 range. The key takeaway here is that cycle syncing does not mean you train less during the luteal phase. It means you train differently. You respect the hormonal load.
You manage the internal climate. But in this manual data analysis, there's a massive hidden trap that the 5K runner coverage exposes. And it centers specifically around ovulation.
Yes, this is huge.
Because if you follow the watch blindly, the day of ovulation usually produces the most spectacular recovery numbers of the entire month, right? HRV is peaking, the resting heart rate drops to the floor, the body battery recharges to 100, the watch is essentially screaming, "You are invincible today! Go attempt a 1-rep max."
And that algorithmic enthusiasm is exactly the trap.
Why?
Because the wearable can only measure cardiovascular and autonomic nervous system readiness. It has absolutely zero capacity to measure the structural vulnerability of your connective tissue.
Okay, unpack that for me.
The coverage highlights a crucial 2017 meta-analysis by Hertzberg and colleagues that examined injury risk across the different phases of the menstrual cycle. They found that the massive surge in peak estrogen that occurs right at ovulation significantly increases ligament laxity.
Ligament laxity.
Yeah.
So they get looser.
Yes. Specifically, it drastically raises the risk of severe anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL, injuries in the knee.
The structural mechanics of that are fascinating. Does estrogen actually change the composition of the ligament?
It does. There are estrogen receptors directly on the ligaments. When estrogen peaks rapidly at ovulation, it decreases collagen synthesis and increases the elasticity of the tissue.
Oh.
The ligament literally becomes looser, making the joint less stable during high-impact dynamic movements like box jumps, heavy squats, or aggressive trail running downhill.
The irony here is just staggering. The exact day your $700 smartwatch gives you the highest, most confident readiness score of the entire month, actively encouraging you to push your body to the absolute mechanical limit, is physically the precise day your joints and ligaments might be at their most biochemically vulnerable state.
It is the ultimate, undeniable example of why you cannot outsource your athletic decision-making entirely to an algorithm. The watch says you are at 100% capacity because your heart is rested. It is utterly blind to the structural reality of your knees. If you do not actively overlay your cycle data on top of your cardiovascular dashboard, you might walk right into a catastrophic injury simply because a male-biased algorithm told you it was a great day to sprint.
Are any of the major hardware manufacturers attempting to fix this gap? Or are they entirely content to leave female athletes managing spreadsheets and physical calendars to figure it out themselves?
There is movement, but it is slow, and it's mostly relegated to the hardware side rather than core algorithmic integration. Newer Garmin models, such as the Venu 3, the Fenix 8, and the Forerunner 970 now feature built-in skin temperature sensors.
Okay, that's a step in the right direction.
It is. Furthermore, Garmin has begun integrating its ecosystem with the Natural Cycles app, allowing the software to use that overnight basal body temperature data to drastically improve the accuracy of cycle phase and ovulation predictions.
Right, because catching that half-degree temperature spike is a highly reliable marker of confirming ovulation and the transition from the follicular to the luteal phase.
Exactly. And this is what the sources clearly note, even with this advanced sensor integration, Garmin still largely silos the information.
Meaning what?
It tracks the cycle incredibly well on one screen, but it does not automatically reach across the software architecture to alter the training readiness algorithm on the other screen.
So it knows you're in the luteal phase, but it doesn't care when it grades you.
Right. It doesn't say, hey, your HRV is suppressed today, but because we know you are in the luteal phase, we are adjusting the baseline and we won't penalize your readiness score. It just displays the two conflicting realities and leaves it entirely up to the user to connect the dots.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We've spent a lot of time on how the software algorithms fail female physiology. But the 5K runner coverage also goes incredibly deep into the physical hardware itself, the actual optical sensor sitting on the back of the watch.
Yes, the hardware has its own set of issues.
And it turns out the sensor behaves differently, not just based on invisible hormonal fluctuations, but based on highly visible physical human traits.
This is a critical area of wearable accuracy that is finally receiving rigorous scientific scrutiny. We need to examine the physical limitations of photoplethysmography, or PPG, which is the technical term for the flashing green light technology we touched on earlier.
Let's start with the physics there. Why do all these devices use green light to measure heart rate?
Green light LEDs are the industry standard because green light penetrates the skin just deeply enough to reach the capillary beds, and it provides a very strong signal-to-noise ratio when the human body is in dynamic motion.
So it's just the best wavelengths for the job.
Basically, the light shines into the tissue, the blood absorbs some of it, and the remaining light reflects back to a photodetector on the watch. As your heart pumps, blood volume in the capillaries expands and contracts, changing the amount of light absorbed.
And the watch counts those volumetric changes as heartbeats.
Exactly. However, there is a fundamental biological hurdle to this optical physics, and that is melanin.
Melanin.
Yes. Melanin is the biological pigment that determines human skin color, and its primary biological function is to absorb light.
So mechanically, the higher the melanin concentration in the skin, the more of that green LED light is absorbed at the surface layer before it can ever reach the blood vessels to reflect back to the sensor.
Precisely. The melanin inherently reduces the strength of the optical signal returning to the photodetector, effectively lowering the signal-to-noise ratio for individuals with darker skin tones.
The theoretical physics make total sense. But what does the clinical science actually say about this in practice? Does this melanin absorption completely ruin the data? Because I feel like every few months there's a viral headline screaming that wearables are totally broken and useless for anyone who isn't pale.
The sources urge us to be exceptionally honest and scientifically nuanced about the uncertainty here. Overclaiming in either direction, either definitively stating that the bias is severe and universal across all devices, or claiming that there is absolutely no problem at all, is simply not supported by the current body of evidence.
So it's messy.
Very messy. For instance, the coverage details a major 2023 systematic review by Korber and colleagues. They looked at 26 different wearable devices across 10 separate studies. The aggregated results were completely mixed.
In what way?
4 studies showed absolutely no skin tone effect on accuracy, 4 studies showed decreased accuracy for darker skin, and 2 studies had mixed results depending on the specific conditions of the tests.
So it's not a universal catastrophic hardware failure.
Yeah.
The accuracy seems to depend heavily on the specific context of use.
Exactly. And the defining contextual variable seems to be exercise intensity.
Intensity, okay.
A recent 2025 study by Hung and colleagues investigated the Fitbit Charge 5. They found that when users were in a resting state, just sitting on a couch, the optical accuracy was fine across all Fitzpatrick skin tones.
Okay, so at rest, it works.
Right. But during moderate to vigorous exercise, specifically when the athlete pushed their cardiovascular system past 60% of their heart rate reserve, the accuracy diverged wildly. For participants with darker skin tones pushing high intensity, the mean error rate reached up to 11.7 beats per minute.
Almost 12 beats per minute off. If you are an athlete executing a highly targeted threshold run, a 12-beat margin of error is the difference between perfectly nailing the physiological adaptation of the workout and completely blowing up and accumulating massive lactic acid debt.
It completely compromises the integrity of targeted training, no question. But the physical challenges to the sensor don't stop at skin tone. Anatomy plays a massive role too.
Anatomy, like wrist size.
Exactly. The sources highlight that wrist circumference, specifically smaller wrists, which are statistically more common in women, plausibly degrades sensor accuracy.
What is the mechanical interference happening with the small wrist?
A narrower, more petite wrist generally has less subcutaneous fat and a different vascular layout. It forces the rigid, flat optical sensor to sit much closer to bone, dense muscle fascia, and tendons.
And those tissues don't pulse.
Exactly. These dense tissues do not pulse with blood volume the way capillaries do, but they move constantly when you swing your arm, creating massive optical interference compared to a larger, flatter, fleshier wrist that actually provides a stable cushion for the sensor.
Do we have hard data on how much wrist size actually corrupts the signal?
The direct isolated research strictly on wrist circumference is pretty thin, but we have incredibly strong proxy data regarding sensor placement over bone versus fleshy tissue.
Let's hear it.
A study published in the JMR Cardio Journal compared the Polar Verity Sense, which is an optical sensor worn high on the fleshy part of the upper arm, against the Polar Vantage V2 worn traditionally on the bony wrist.
Okay, what were the results?
During exercise, the upper arm sensor maintained a tiny error margin of just 1.43 beats per minute. The wrist sensor had an error of 6.41 beats per minute. Placing a flat optical sensor on a small, bony wrist that is swinging violently during a sprint is just a profoundly hostile physical environment for optical physics to operate in.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around the physics here. It's like trying to take a crystal clear, high-resolution photograph through a heavily tinted window while you are sprinting over a bumpy, uneven cobblestone street and your camera is strapped to a vibrating jackhammer.
Yes.
It is honestly a miracle of engineering that the watch gets a usable reading at all.
That analogy perfectly captures the compounding physical interferences. And understanding these hardware limitations raises a massive structural question regarding consumer protection.
How so?
Consumer wearables, your Garmin, your Apple Watch, your WA, they are not classified as diagnostic medical devices. They are not FDA regulated in the same stringent manner as a clinical pulse oximeter used in an intensive care unit.
What does that lack of regulation practically mean for the consumer buying the device?
It means there's no federal or regulatory mandate forcing these tech companies to rigorously validate their optical sensors across all Fitzpatrick skin types or across the full spectrum of human wrist sizes before bringing a $600 device to market.
That's crazy.
They certainly conduct internal testing, but they have absolutely no legal obligation to publish the demographic breakdowns of those validation cohorts.
So as a consumer, you could easily be buying a highly expensive device that was validated almost entirely on large, pale wrists, and you would have absolutely no way of knowing until you try to execute a threshold interval block and your data just looks like complete garbage.
Which is exactly why the overarching advice regarding hardware loops right back to the chest strap.
The old reliable chest strap.
Yeah. Always. If you demand absolute clinical confidence in your heart rate data during intense exertion, regardless of your skin tone or your anatomical wrist size, you must bypass the optical sensor entirely. You use a chest strap, which completely abandons light-based estimation and instead measures the actual electrical voltage of your heart muscle contracting.
So hardware errors based on physical traits are incredibly frustrating. Algorithmic blind spots regarding the menstrual cycle are infuriating, but the sources highlight one specific area where misinterpreting this wearable data stops being merely an annoyance regarding fitness tracking and crosses the line into a severe clinical danger. And that topic is RDS.
Yes, RDS, which stands for Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. And let me be clear, this section carries the most absolute clinical weight of our entire deep dive today.
It's that serious.
It is. RDS is one of the most insidious and commonly overlooked causes of catastrophic performance decline and long-term physiological damage in female endurance athletes.
Let's define the terminology clearly before we look at the data. What exactly is RADS? Because people who have been around sports for a long time might recognize it under its older, now outdated name, the female athlete triad.
Right. It was formerly known as the female athlete triad, which focused specifically on disordered eating, amenorrhea, which is the loss of the menstrual cycle, and osteoporosis.
But it's broader now.
Much broader. The International Olympic Committee officially updated the diagnostic term in 2014 to RADS because the condition is far more expansive. It degrades the entire systemic body, affecting immune function, cardiovascular health, protein synthesis, not just a triad of symptoms.
And it can affect men too, right?
It can affect male athletes too, although it remains vastly more prevalent in women. At its physiological core, RADS is a brutal, inescapable math problem. It is defined entirely by a metric called energy availability.
Break down the math of energy availability. What is the equation?
The formula for energy availability is your total dietary energy intake. So the calories you eat minus your exercise energy expenditure, the calories you burn specifically during training. You take that remaining caloric number and divide it by your fat-free mass, which is your muscle, bone, and organ weight.
Okay, let me use a diet analogy here. Energy availability is essentially your company's operating budget. You have revenue coming in from food. You immediately pay your massive non-negotiable tax bill, which is the energy burned running 10 miles.
Right.
Whatever cash is left over in the bank account is what you have available to actually run the physical infrastructure of the business, repairing the building, keeping the lights on, paying the employees.
I will definitely take that analogy because it perfectly illustrates the clinical threshold. Sports scientists have identified a hard clinical line, 30 kilocalories per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. Yes, if your available biological budget drops below that 30 mark, you enter a state of low energy availability. Your body simply does not have enough biological currency to support both the massive tax of your training load and the basic essential physiological functions required to keep a human alive and healthy.
So what happens?
The brain is forced to make executive cuts. It starts shutting down non-essential biological departments to prevent starvation.
And we need to explicitly differentiate here because the sources are very clear on this. There's intentional and unintentional low energy availability, right?
Yes. Intentional low energy availability occurs when an athlete is deliberately restricting caloric intake, perhaps pursuing a specific aggressive race weight or dealing with complex eating disorders, which requires profound psychological and nutritional intervention.
Right.
But unintentional low energy availability is incredibly common and deceptive among recreational and amateur runners.
How does that happen?
Well, say you decide to sign up for your first marathon. You double your weekly running mileage from 20 miles to 40 miles, but you don't realize that to support that massive increase in output, you need to drastically, intentionally increase your dense carbohydrate intake. You eat what feels like a normal diet, but you accidentally mathematically starve your biological system.
And REDS does not announce itself with a loud, acute trauma like a snapped bone or a torn Achilles tendon. It creeps in slowly as the system shut down. So where does wearable tech intersect with this? What are the early warning signs of this systemic bankruptcy that a watch can actually flag before the athlete feels broken?
This is where wearable tech transitions from a fitness toy to a vital early warning system. Your wearable will actually pick up the subtle metabolic distress signals weeks or even months before you physically feel an injury.
What's first flag?
The first major glaring flag is a persistent, multi-week degradation in your baseline HRV. We aren't talking about a single low HRV reading after one hard interval session. This is your HRV baseline trending steadily downward for 3, 4, 5 weeks straight, even when your training load has remained stable or you've introduced rest days.
So the nervous system is just fried.
Exactly. The autonomic nervous system is screaming that it is in a constant state of severe stress trying to run the machinery on fumes.
And regarding tracking that specific nocturnal HRV data to catch REDS early, the sources point to a 2025 study by Dial and colleagues, right?
Yes, the Dial-L study evaluated consumer wearables and found that for tracking the specific nuances of nocturnal HRV, the Oura Ring 4 was actually the most highly accurate among current consumer devices. So if you are monitoring this, device choice really does matter.
So HRV plummets because the body is panicked. What is the next systemic flag that tech can catch?
Skin temperature alterations, specifically regarding the menstrual cycle. We discussed in detail how core temperature is supposed to rise predictably during the luteal phase post-ovulation due to progesterone.
Right, that half-degree spike.
Yes. If a female athlete is developing REDS, the reproductive system is often the first major biological department the brain shuts down because reproducing is incredibly energy intensive and non-essential for immediate survival.
It just cuts the power to that system.
Exactly. The body will suppress ovulation entirely to save calories. If you are wearing an Oura ring or a W-Whoop, you will suddenly see a blunted or completely absent luteal phase temperature rise. Your monthly temperature chart just flatlines.
Which mathematically means the biological cycle is shutting down even if you don't realize it yet. And how does this manifest in the daily recovery scores on a Garmin or W?
You will see consistently brutally poor Garmin body battery recharges. You might follow all the rules, go to bed early, sleep for a solid 9 hours, but you wake up and your body battery only hits 45.
Because you aren't actually recovering.
Right. Or if you use the W ecosystem, you will see a sustained, unexplainable mismatch. Your daily strain scores are high, but your recovery scores are perpetually trapped in the red or yellow zones week after week, regardless of how much you rest.
So if a female endurance athlete is looking at her data dashboard, say she sees her VO2 max stagnating or dropping, her Whoop recovery has been in the red for 3 weeks despite sleeping well, her HRV is in the basement, and her temperature graph is completely flat, what is the immediate action step? Because the standard athletic mentality is to assume the watch is broken or to just push harder and grind through the fatigue.
Absolutely do not push through it. And this brings us to the crucial, immovable clinical boundary that the sources emphasize over and over. Wearables cannot, under any circumstances, diagnose RTS.
They just sound the alarm.
Exactly. They can only flag the physiological mismatch. If you observe the specific constellation of data patterns, the declining HRV, the flatlining temperature, the intractable poor recovery, you do not attempt to biohack your way out of it with a new supplement. You do not try to train through the fatigue.
What do?
You go immediately to a sports clinician. Because the unseen damage ERDS inflicts on the body, like the halting of bone turnover leading to osteopenia, the suppression of immune function, the degradation of cardiovascular health, all of that is severe, long-lasting, and requires clinical intervention to reverse safely.
I want to pause on the menstrual cycle aspect of RDS for a second, because the sources mention a frankly terrifying statistical reality about how deceptive this condition can be. A lot of women might hear this and think, well, I still get my period every month, so I clearly don't have RDS. My system hasn't shut down.
Relying on the presence of a visual bleed to confirm hormonal health is a profoundly dangerous biological assumption.
Wow, okay.
The 5K runner coverage highlights a classic foundational 1998 study by D'Souza and colleagues that examined this exact issue. They took a cohort of recreational female runners who all reported having seemingly normal, regular menstrual cycles.
So they thought they were fine.
Right. They brought them into the lab, tested their actual hormonal profiles, and found that a staggering 55% of these women actually had severe ovulatory dysfunction.
Wait, more than half of the women who thought they were perfectly healthy were not actually ovulating.
Correct. More than half were experiencing severe luteal phase deficiency or were entirely anovulatory, meaning no egg was ever released despite experiencing a regular monthly bleed. The presence of blood does not mean the complex endocrine machinery of the hormones is functioning properly behind the scenes.
That is deeply unsettling.
Yeah.
And it gets exponentially more complicated if the athlete is using hormonal contraceptives, like the standard birth control pill, right?
It becomes a total clinical blind spot. Hormonal birth control pills operate by suppressing natural ovulation and substituting synthetic hormones. When you take the placebo pills at the end of the month, the drop in synthetic hormones forces a withdrawal bleed.
It physically fakes a normal menstrual cycle.
Exactly. This completely masks the loss of a natural period, which, biologically speaking, is often the loudest, most undeniable alarm bell the female body has to warn an athlete that she has entered RDS.
So the wearable technology, the subtle, continuous tracking of the HRV collapse and the flatlining basal body temperature, is essentially catching the metabolic stress signals that the chemically faked period is actively trying to hide from the athlete. That is incredibly powerful data, provided you know exactly how to interpret the warning signs.
It is powerful, but it requires the athlete to look at the data holistically across months, not just day by day. The watch acts as the smoke detector generating the alarm. A qualified sports physician is the fire department that has to come in and actually diagnose the structural damage.
Okay, we've covered at length how standard wrist-based wearables struggle, and often fail, to accurately map female-specific physiology across the standard monthly cycle and into severe clinical spaces like RDS. But what happens when the technology architecture is built specifically for these distinct female life stages? Because the 5K runner coverage also explores technology explicitly designed for the extreme physiological metamorphosis of pregnancy.
Pregnancy is perhaps the ultimate undisputed stress test for both the female biological organism and for any tracking technology attempting to monitor it.
Definitely.
If we examine the raw physiology of pregnancy, the systemic changes are just staggering. During the first trimester, basal body temperature rises significantly and stays elevated. By late pregnancy, the body creates so much new fluid that total blood volume jumps by an astonishing 45%.
Almost half again as much blood.
Yeah. Concurrently, the resting heart rate climbs by an average of 15 to 20 beats per minute just to circulate that massive new fluid volume.
Your body is essentially running an internal biological ultramarathon for 9 consecutive months. Your previous baseline metrics are just completely obliterated. So a standard wrist wearable running a standard algorithm is just going to look at that data and panic.
It absolutely panics. A standard algorithm looks at a resting heart rate that is 20 beats higher than last month, an HRV that has plummeted because the system is under immense strain building a human, and 45% more blood volume, totally altering the optical density of the wrist tissue.
It thinks you're dying.
Oh, right. The watch assumes the user is in a state of catastrophic physiological failure or severe illness, and it just gives atrocious recovery scores for months on end. But the sources highlight a piece of environmental technology that actually adapts its core logic to this state, the 8 Sleep Pod 5.
Let's look at the 8 Sleep. This is the smart mattress cover that actively circulates water through a grid to heat or cool the sleeping surface based on biometric feedback. How does an environmental sleep tracker handle the physiological chaos of pregnancy better than a wrist wearable?
It handles it better because it relies on a dedicated, algorithmically distinct pregnancy mode. And the methodology behind this mode is what makes it scientifically fascinating.
Okay.
It does not just passively react to your elevated heart rate and assume you are sick. When a user activates this mode, they input their specific due date into the application. The system then cross-references the user's current week of gestation against a proprietary database built on 45,000 nights of clinical pregnancy sleep data.
So the software actually possesses a topological map of what week of gestation you are in and what the specific biological thermal load of that week should be.
Yes, because it understands the predictable trimester-by-trimester trajectory of pregnancy physiology. It alters the thermal environment preemptively.
Preemptively?
Yeah, it anticipates the massive metabolic heat the pregnant body is about to generate during the night, and it initiates cooling protocols before the temperature spike occurs, rather than waiting until the user is already sweating, waking up, and suffering a degraded sleep cycle.
That is brilliant.
And furthermore, because it operates on a dual-zone cooling system, the pregnant athlete can run her side of the bed at an aggressive, icy temperature during the highly thermogenic third trimester, while her partner maintains a completely normal thermal environment on the other side.
And it also features a specific protocol for sudden, acute temperature anomalies, right? Like hot flashes.
Yes, it includes a dedicated hot flash mode. Roughly a third of pregnant women and a massive percentage of menopausal women experience severe hot flashes due to rapid, aggressive hormonal shifts.
Right.
This specific mode is utilized during pregnancy and the postpartum period to instantly override the standard cooling curve and aggressively flush the mattress grid with cold water. It combats the sudden, severe temperature spike dynamically, allowing the user's core temperature to stabilize so they can return to deep sleep without having to physically get out of bed or alter the room's HVAC system.
We should not gloss over the clinical stakes of this either. This is not merely a discussion about consumer luxury or avoiding night sweats. The sources draw a direct line between managing sleep temperature during pregnancy and major systemic health outcomes.
The clinical stakes are vital here. The coverage specifically cites peer-reviewed research linking improved, uninterrupted sleep architecture during pregnancy to highly significant health outcomes. Poor sleep is directly correlated with higher risks of developing gestational diabetes and higher risks of preeclampsia, which is a potentially dangerous blood pressure condition.
So sleep is literally medicine here.
Absolutely. By utilizing technology that actually understands the pregnant baseline to facilitate deep sleep, the athlete gives her body the necessary recovery bandwidth to manage the immense systemic stress of growing a human.
So what does this all mean? Let me synthesize what we are seeing across all these different pieces of technology. It seems the fundamental lesson is that technology is only useful when it accurately understands the biological reality of the organism it is measuring. Forcing a dynamically changing female body to conform to a generic, static, male-biased baseline doesn't just produce bad data, it actively gaslights the user.
That's a great way to phrase it.
When the technology actually knows you are pregnant or knows you're in the luteal phase of your cycle, the data stops being judgmental and starts being supportive.
That is exactly the synthesis we need to arrive at, which brings us directly to the final overarching theme drawn from all of the source material.
The baseline principle. We have covered a massive expanse of scientific ground today. We have detailed the menstrual cycle's profound impact on physiological training metrics. We unpacked the wildly biased, fundamentally flawed mathematical assumptions inside VO2 Max algorithms.
We covered a lot.
We really did. We explored the physical hardware limitations of optical sensors, attempting to read through darker skin tones and on smaller wrist anatomies. We highlighted the stark clinical dangers of ignoring the early REDS signals hidden in wearable data, and we examined the emergence of life-stage-specific environmental tech for pregnancy. So how does a female endurance athlete take this massive mountain of complex, sometimes conflicting information and actually apply it when she looks at her wrist tomorrow morning?
The ultimate defining recommendation from all of the 5K runners' extensive coverage requires a fundamental psychological shift in how athletes view their devices. Wearable data is only mathematically and practically useful to female athletes when it is treated strictly as a highly personalized baseline, rather than an absolute, objective diagnostic truth handed down from some infallible machine.
Meaning the athlete has to stop comparing her Garmin readiness score to her male running partner score, and she has to stop treating the watch like an omniscient oracle that knows her body better than she does.
Precisely. A Garmin readiness score, a WOP recovery number, or an Oura sleep score means absolutely nothing in a statistical vacuum. The number only gains actionable meaning when the athlete deliberately contextualizes it against three distinct personal variables: her current hormonal cycle phase, her current training block load, and her broader life stage.
Right.
Because the technology industry has largely failed to build this vital context natively into the software architecture, the athlete is forced to build the context herself. She must become the final, ultimate algorithm.
Let's run a final practical scenario on how to be that algorithm. I wake up on a Tuesday. My training plan says I have a heavy threshold workout, but my watch says my HRV is severely suppressed and my recovery is in the red. I don't just blindly skip my workout. I run through a diagnostic checklist. First, am I in my luteal phase? Yes, I am 5 days out from my period.
Okay, check.
Second, is my core temperature slightly elevated naturally right now?
Right.
Yes. Third, has my actual training volume been unusually high this week? No, it's been a normal week. Conclusion, I am not overtrained. My body is not failing. I am just hormonal. I can still train today. I just need to respect the physiology and adjust the intensity from a threshold run to a strict, slow zone 2 run.
That is the exact diagnostic process. And if we connect this to the broader philosophy of female endurance training, the goal of understanding this data is never to find a scientific excuse to rest or quit. The sources are definitive on this point. Women should not lower their athletic goals, nor should they arbitrarily train less during the luteal phase.
Right, they just need to train differently.
Exactly. They need to strategically shift away from high-volume, high-strain cardiovascular work and pivot toward targeted intensity, respecting the body's altered thermogenic state and its need for slightly longer recovery intervals and altered fueling strategies. It is entirely about working intelligently with the physiological current rather than blindly swimming against it.
I absolutely love that perspective. It completely transforms these frustrating, seemingly random metrics from a source of daily anxiety into a deeply personalized, highly empowering map of your own unique physiology. You aren't broken. Your fitness isn't disappearing overnight. The algorithm is just a little blind. But once you understand the biological and mathematical reasons why the data looks the way it does, you take the power back from the tech.
Knowledge of your own systemic biology is always the ultimate performance enhancer. When you learn how to read the true signals, whether that means spotting a mathematically false VO2 max drop caused by a luteal phase heart rate spike, or recognizing the subtle early HRV warnings of an impending REDS collapse, you stop being a passive, anxious consumer of algorithmic data. You elevate yourself into an active, informed manager of your own physiological potential.
It is so empowering to realize that the machine isn't smarter than the body. And it leaves me with this final provocative thought for you to chew on as you lace up your shoes and head out for your next run. If female athletes have been out here setting world records, crushing ultramarathons, and hitting personal bests for decades while actively fighting against training plans, mathematical algorithms, and physical hardware that were explicitly built to optimize male bodies, what on earth are they going to be capable of when the technology industry finally catches up to them?
I think we are going to see physiological barriers broken that we currently believe are absolute ceilings.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the source material. We hope this comprehensive breakdown changes the way you look at the data on your wrist, and more importantly, changes the way you listen to the biological signals of your own body. Keep tracking the data, keep questioning the algorithms, and we will catch you on the next one.